The galaxy was ancient, ruled by empires that had stood for millennia. The Galactic Council, a coalition of the most powerful species, dictated the fate of lesser civilizations, determining which races thrived and which were left to fade into obscurity. To them, humanity was barely worth acknowledging, a minor species, technologically behind, strategically irrelevant. When humans first stepped beyond their solar system, they arrived with optimism, believing they had entered an age of cooperation, trade, and discovery. They sent diplomats to the council, eager to establish themselves as equals among the stars. But their hopes were met with indifference. The great empires had no need for humanity. Their ships were crude, their worlds unremarkable. They had no rare elements, no groundbreaking technology, no military power to demand respect. Other species, like the Veshtari, had spent thousands of years refining interstellar travel. The Threx Dominion had already mastered energy manipulation centuries before humans even understood quantum physics. What did humanity offer? Nothing. They were tolerated, but not welcomed, allowed to build their colonies, but given no voice. When they spoke in council halls, they were ignored. Some species treated them with mild amusement, others with outright contempt. Humanity was not seen as a threat, nor as an asset, just a background detail in the grand, unchanging history of the galaxy. Then came the Drakthal. The Drakthal were not diplomats. They were conquerors, warriors born from a long lineage of destruction. Their society was built on the principle that only the strong deserved to exist. Weak species were meant to be conquered, enslaved, or erased. For centuries, the Council had turned a blind eye to the Drakthal's brutality. When the warlords set their sights on a weaker race, the Council did not intervene. They had rules, and one of the most sacred was non-interference. If a species could not defend itself, then it had no place in the galactic order. The Drakthal arrived in human space with an armada. The first attacks were swift and merciless. Entire colonies vanished overnight. Communications were cut. Planets that had been thriving outposts of human expansion were reduced to nothing but silent wastelands. The humans fought back with everything they had: outdated warships, planetary defenses, ground forces, but they were unprepared. The Drakthal ships were vast and heavily armored, designed for prolonged planetary sieges. Their weapons tore through human defenses with terrifying ease. The humans' missiles barely scratched their hulls. Their laser cannons melted through human ships in seconds. Earth's leaders pleaded with the Council. They did not ask for armies. They asked for mediation, for political pressure. Anything that could force the Drakthal to stop. The Council's response? Silence. In their eyes, humanity had been tested and found unworthy. The Drakthal were not violating any laws. They were simply doing what had been done to countless civilizations before. It was the way of the galaxy. The war did not last long. Humanity's fleets were shattered in a series of catastrophic battles. The final stand was fought in orbit above Elias Prime, where the last major human defense fleet tried, and failed, to stop the Drakthal advance. Captain Elias Carter, once an officer in Earth's Defense Command, stood on the bridge of his warship and watched the battle unfold. He saw the flashes of light as human ships were torn apart, heard the desperate calls for help from civilian transports that were being hunted down. He gave the order to retreat, not out of fear, but because there was no other choice. It was not a war, it was a massacre. Millions perished. The Drakthal gave no quarter. Cities were burned to cinders. Those who surrendered were chained and sold, their labor fueling the next warlord's campaign. The name human became a whispered warning among conquered worlds, just another species that had reached too far and paid the price. But they had not all been taken. A handful of ships, military vessels, cargo freighters, and civilian transports escaped into the darkness of uncharted space. A few thousand survivors, scattered, leaderless, wounded. They had no home, no government, no future. They were the last remnants of a broken race. On the edge of the war front, in the cold silence of exile, Captain Carter stood among them. He looked at the shattered remains of humanity's once great dreams and made a vow. They would survive, they would rebuild, and one day, they would return. In the cold abyss of deep space, where light from distant stars barely reached, A handful of ships drifted through the darkness, damaged, depleted, and desperate. These were the last survivors of a fallen species, remnants of a people who had once dreamed of unity among the stars. Now they had no home. Inside the bridge of the Resolute, a former Earth warship now reduced to a mobile command post, Captain Elias Carter stood motionless, staring at the tattered fleet before him. His face, once marked by the quiet confidence of a veteran officer, was now a mask of exhaustion and barely contained fury. Before the war, he had served as a strategist for Earth's defense forces, leading countless training simulations against theoretical invaders. But none of them had prepared him for this, for the brutal, merciless efficiency of the Drakthal. There was no diplomacy, no warnings, no chance for surrender, only annihilation. Behind him, the voices of his remaining officers filled the dimly lit bridge. Commander Lena Voss, his second-in-command, spoke first. "We've lost contact with the Silver Dawn. Last civilian transport we had on record," she said, her voice hollow. "That's another 5,000 souls. Gone." A heavy silence fell over them. The Silver Dawn had been one of the few non-combat ships that had made it out of the Sol system before the final Drakthal advance. Now, like so many others, it was nothing but another ghost ship, lost to the void. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, their chief engineer, shook his head as he examined the fleet's dwindling resources. "Fuel's running low. We've got enough rations. For a few months at best, maybe a year if we cut rations and stretch supplies." His voice grew quieter. But after that, he didn't need to finish. They all knew. The survivors had scattered in different directions, running from the enemy, hoping to find a place, any place, where they could regroup. But space was vast, and the Drakthal had made sure that no human world remained. Earth itself was now a burning husk, its atmosphere poisoned, its cities reduced to nothing but smoldering ruins. Humanity was on the verge of extinction. Captain Carter exhaled, his gaze hardening. "We're not dying out here," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Not like this." The bridge crew turned toward him, waiting. "We need to rebuild," he continued. "We need a home, and we need a plan." Lena hesitated. "A home? Where? Every known system is either under Drakthal control or hostile to human refugees. The Council won't help us, and the other species, they're too afraid to risk standing against them." Carter nodded. He had no illusions about the Council's cowardice. They had abandoned humanity the moment the war began, unwilling to risk their fragile alliances. Even now, they likely sat in their great halls, pretending that Earth had never existed, rewriting history to erase the shame of their inaction, but he had no intention of begging for their help. "There's a system on the far edge of the galaxy," he said, bringing up a holographic map. "Uncharted space. It was supposed to be a long-term colonization project before the war. The Drakthal never attacked it because it wasn't a priority target. Just a research station and a half-built infrastructure network." Hale frowned. "Are you talking about Erebus 9? Carter nodded. Lena's eyes narrowed. "That system is practically a graveyard. No terraforming, no atmosphere, barely any resources. The only reason it was even considered for colonization was its location, far from everything. Isolated." Carter gave her a grim smile. "Exactly. The Drakthal had no reason to look for them there. The Council had already dismissed humanity as extinct. No one was coming to save them. No one would even be looking, which meant they had one advantage left: time. If we can establish a foothold," Carter continued, "if we can start rebuilding in secret, then one day we'll have the means to fight back." Silence filled the bridge. For years, they had lived under the belief that humanity could integrate peacefully with the greater galactic community. That war was something to be avoided, not embraced. That belief had been shattered. Lena crossed her arms. "Even if we make it there, even if we survive, what then? We can't just hide forever." Carter met her gaze. "No," he agreed. "We can't." He turned back toward the view screen, watching the stars beyond. In his mind, He could still hear the final screams of Earth's cities as they fell. He could still see the flashes of destruction, the shadows of Drakthal warships blotting out the sky. "We're going to make them regret the day they thought we were weak," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "We're going to take back everything they stole from us. And when the Drakthal least expected it, humanity would rise again." The Resolute emerged from the depths of hyperspace, its hull scarred and battle-worn but still intact. The ship, once a proud vessel of Earth's fleet, now bore the marks of countless skirmishes, patched armor plating, jury-rigged systems, and a command bridge that had seen too many desperate battles. Around it, the remnants of humanity's fleet followed, a collection of ragged, half-functioning ships carrying the last survivors of a race that had once thrived across the stars. Before them lay Erebus 9, a desolate world orbiting a dying sun at the far edge of the galaxy. The planet's surface was a wasteland of jagged rock and ice, its atmosphere thin, barely breathable, but stable enough to sustain long-term habitation with the right infrastructure. To the untrained eye, it was a graveyard. To Captain Elias Carter, it was hope. On the bridge of the Resolute, Carter stood in silence as he observed the planet through the ship's main viewport. It wasn't Earth, it never would be, but it was something they could build on. Lena Voss, standing beside him, let out a slow breath. "We're really doing this," she murmured. Carter didn't look away from the planet. "We don't have a choice." Behind them, Marcus Hale, their chief engineer, ran a final scan of the surface. The readings were as expected: low temperatures, high radiation pockets, unstable magnetic fields in certain regions. Not an ideal world by any means, but better than drifting in space, waiting for supplies to run out. "The old research station is still there," Hale said. "Barely functional, but intact. Looks like it still has power." Carter turned. "Any signs of movement?" Hale shook his head. "Nothing. If there were researchers left, they're long dead." Silence settled over the bridge. Every planet, every station, every outpost, everything that had once belonged to humanity had been wiped clean. The Drakthal had been thorough. Their extermination had been methodical, systematic. They hadn't just wanted humanity defeated. They wanted them erased. But they had failed. Carter straightened. "We move in now. Get the first landing teams on the ground. I want a full assessment of the station and a resource report within the next 6 hours." Lena hesitated. "If anyone sees us..." "No one will." Carter's voice left no room for doubt. The galaxy believed humanity was dead. The Drakthal had no reason to waste resources scanning the fringes of known space, and the Galactic Council was too cowardly to risk provoking their new overlords by investigating what had happened to Earth's remnants. For the first time since the war began, they were invisible, and that meant they had an advantage. Hours later, the surface of Erebus. The wind howled across the barren plains, kicking up spirals of dust and ice as the landing shuttles descended. The first boots touched the surface in over a decade, armored figures stepping cautiously into the unknown. Carter led the first team himself. His suit's environmental sensors flickered erratically as it adjusted to the harsh, thin atmosphere. The gravity was slightly weaker than Earth's, giving each step a strange, weightless feel. Ahead, the research station loomed, a sprawling network of reinforced steel structures, half buried beneath layers of dust and debris. The entrance was still intact, its airlock sealed shut. "Voss, status?" Carter called out. Lena, working alongside a team of engineers, pressed a gloved hand against the station's outer controls. "The system's ancient, but it's responding. Looks like the facility's been running on emergency power all this time." Marcus Hale let out a low whistle. "Damn! This thing's been running for over a decade without maintenance? Either the engineers who built it were geniuses, or we just got lucky." Carter wasn't one to believe in luck. "Get the doors open." With a hiss of escaping air, the outer doors unsealed, revealing the dark corridors beyond. The team moved in, weapons ready, sweeping the interior for signs of life. Nothing. The station was silent, abandoned, but it was functional. The old generators still hummed faintly beneath their feet, the ancient computers flickering to life as the team reactivated systems that had been dormant for years. It was a start. Over the next several days, the work began, in earnest. The station became the heart of their new colony, a hidden fortress buried in the darkness of Erebus 9. Rations were stretched, materials were salvaged, old ship components were stripped down and repurposed. The first hydroponic farms were established, growing the first food humans had seen in months. And slowly, very slowly, humanity began to rebuild. Months later, a new foundation. The colony grew in secret, hidden from the watchful eyes of the galaxy. More ships arrived, one by one, survivors who had drifted in the void, hoping for a miracle, finding it in Erebus 9. With them came knowledge. Scientists, engineers, strategists, all the minds that had once driven Earth's expansion, now dedicated themselves to something far greater, not just survival, retribution. Deep within the station's underground vaults, Carter stood before a newly assembled council of survivors: Lena, Hale, dozens of others, leaders, thinkers, warriors. They had all come to the same conclusion. Hiding will only last so long, Lena said. Eventually someone will come looking. The Drakthal, the council. Someone will figure out we're still alive. Carter nodded. Which is why we don't just hide. He stepped forward, activating a holographic display. A three-dimensional map of the galaxy materialized before them, marked with the locations of major Drakthal strongholds, resource depots, and supply lines. Our enemy thinks we're gone, he said, his voice steady, filled with something that had been missing. For a long time, purpose. But they made one mistake. He zoomed in on a single point. A remote outpost, lightly defended, rich in stolen human technology. A perfect target. They left survivors. Lena's eyes flickered with understanding. You're talking about a resistance. Carter met her gaze. I'm talking about taking back everything they stole from us, one piece at a time. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the others nodded. This was no longer just about survival. It was about vengeance. And it started now. The command center of the hidden colony hummed with energy, a stark contrast to the lifeless husk it had been mere months ago. The once abandoned Erebus 9 research station was now the beating heart of humanity's last hope. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a war machine in the making. In the dim glow of flickering console lights, Captain Elias Carter stood at the center of the room, his hands resting on the edges of a holographic map. The display floated above the table, a three-dimensional projection of the Drakthal supply routes stretching across the sector. The enemy had grown complacent, convinced that humanity had been erased from existence. Their supply lines were thinly defended, their outposts minimally guarded. They had no reason to fear a dead race. That mistake would cost them. Lena Voss studied the display beside Carter, arms crossed, her gaze sharp and calculating. Their nearest outpost has a fleet depot. Small, but stocked with supplies and weapons. She zoomed in, isolating a single structure on the hologram. A fuel station orbiting a moon, lightly guarded. If we hit it fast, we can grab everything we need and be gone before they even realize what happened. Marcus Hale let out a low whistle. You do realize what you're suggesting, right? This isn't just scavenging wrecks or salvaging old tech. We're talking about attacking a Drakthal base. If we screw this up, they'll know we're still alive. Carter's voice was calm, unwavering. Which is why we won't screw this up. Silence settled over the room as the gathered survivors processed the weight of their decision. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were fighting. Back, no more running, no more waiting. The first strike would be tonight. Hours later, aboard the Resolute. The ship's interior was darkened, running on minimal power to avoid detection. Inside the drop bay, soldiers donned their combat gear, checking weapons, securing helmets, and preparing for the mission ahead. There were only 20 of them, 20 against an enemy empire, but every single one of them was ready to die for this cause. Carter stood at the front of the group, his expression unreadable as he looked over his team. The soldiers weren't just warriors, they were survivors. Some had been pilots, engineers, researchers before the war. But now, they were soldiers, hardened by the loss of their homeworld and the brutality of the Drakthal. Lena stepped up beside him, her voice steady. All teams are prepped. We're running cold. No emissions, no comms. If they detect us, we're dead. Carter nodded, then turned to his crew. "This is it," he said. "We strike fast, take what we need, and disappear. This is just the beginning. But if we fail, there won't be another chance. The enemy thinks we're weak. They think we're gone. Let's remind them who we are." The soldiers responded with grim nods. They didn't need speeches. They needed action. A countdown appeared on the ship's central display. 10 seconds to drop. 9. Carter adjusted his rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was old, battle-scarred, just like the Resolute, just like humanity itself. But it still worked. 8. Lena clenched her fists. Beside her, Marcus Hale muttered a quiet prayer under his breath. 7. The drop bay doors hissed, depressurizing. Beyond them, the cold vacuum of space waited. 6. The outpost loomed below, its lights flickering against the darkness. The Drakthal had no idea what was coming. 5. Carter's breathing slowed, focused. This was it. 4. The ship adjusted its position. A perfect approach. 3. Weapons armed. Systems green. 2. No turning back now. 1. The drop pods launched. Assault on the outpost. The blackness of space became a blur of motion as the drop pods rocketed toward the surface. They cut through the atmosphere like meteors, their heat shields glowing as they plunged toward the station. Inside his pod, Carter remained still, gripping the safety restraints as the G-forces pressed against him. A voice crackled through his earpiece, the automated countdown until impact. 5 seconds. The enemy still hadn't noticed. Their sensors were outdated, their security weak. The Drakthal had grown too comfortable in their dominance. 4 seconds. The station's defenses remained offline. No alarms, no weapons activating. They weren't even paying attention. 3 seconds. Carter's hands curled into fists. They had no idea they were already dead. 2 seconds. The drop pods slammed into the station's outer hull. The moment they impacted, explosive charges detonated, blasting the pods open. Soldiers surged out, weapons ready. The battle had begun. Gunfire erupted as the first Drakthal patrol was caught off guard, their bulky reptilian forms barely reacting before they were cut down. The humans moved like shadows, fast and precise, sweeping through the corridors. Carter fired twice, 2 shots, 2 kills. He didn't stop to watch the bodies fall. Lena's voice crackled in his earpiece. "We're in, moving toward the control center." "Hale, get those supply crates locked down," Carter ordered. The engineer's response was breathless but determined. "On it!" A siren blared through the facility. The Drakthal had finally realized what was happening. Too late. Carter's squad moved deeper, taking corridor after corridor, clearing rooms with ruthless efficiency. For the first time since the war began, humans were on the offensive. A heavy blast door loomed ahead. Behind it, the outpost's command center. Carter signaled, "Set charges." Within seconds, the explosives were placed. A single detonation, and the doors were blasted inward. Inside, the Drakthal officers barely had time to react. Carter fired first. 2 enemies down before they could even reach their weapons. Lena took out another with a single shot to the head. The last Drakthal, a high-ranking officer, froze, his clawed hands raised in surrender. His yellow eyes flickered with something strange. "Fear. You," he rasped. "You should not be here." Carter aimed his rifle between the alien's eyes. "Neither should you." He pulled the trigger. Victory and extraction. The outpost fell. In under 15 minutes. Hale and his team secured the supply crates. Weapons, rations, fuel, even stolen human technology the Drakthal had taken from conquered worlds. The haul was beyond valuable. As they moved to extract, Lena looked at Carter. "They'll know something happened here. They'll come looking." Carter didn't hesitate. "Then we'll make sure they don't find anything useful." He activated his comms. "Hale, set the reactors to overload. We're wiping this place clean." Minutes later, as the Resolute and its crew escaped into the void, the station erupted into fire, a massive explosion ripping through space. No evidence, no survivors, just a message. Humanity wasn't just alive. They were coming back. The explosion was visible even from orbit. A raging fireball of metal, plasma, and oxygen-starved flames bloomed into the void, a silent scream in the cold darkness of space. What had once been a vital Drakthal supply depot was now nothing but wreckage and drifting embers. Aboard the Resolute, the humans watched in grim satisfaction as their first true strike against the enemy came to a fiery conclusion. Elias Carter stood on the bridge, his knuckles white against the railing as he observed the destruction through the forward viewport. The station was gone. No evidence left. No trace of their presence. Just as planned. Yet beneath the quiet victory, he knew the cost. The Drakthal were not fools. They would know someone had done this, and soon they would come looking. The enemy awakens far across the sector. In the heart of Drakthal-controlled space, a warship stirred. The Vorak Tal was unlike the smaller cruisers that patrolled the Empire's borders. It was a hunting vessel, its hull scarred from countless battles, its armor layered with the trophies of conquered worlds. It moved like a living thing, vast and ominous, prowling through the void with the patience of a predator. Inside the command chamber, Overlord Kraveth stood motionless. His reptilian eyes narrowed as he studied the incoming report. The message had come from a surviving distress beacon, brief, fragmented, but unmistakable. A supply station had been wiped out. Completely. He exhaled slowly, the deep growl of his species vibrating through the chamber. This was no accident, no malfunction, no pirate raid. Something had hunted that station. A low snarl rumbled in his throat. His clawed hand flexed against the armrest of his throne-like seat. For cycles upon cycles, the Drakthal had expanded their empire, carving their dominance into the stars. They had crushed humanity beneath their heel, reduced their fleets to burning wreckage, driven them to the edge of extinction. And yet, something remained. A soft chime echoed through the chamber as a transmission connected. A holographic figure flickered into view. Subjugator Zelroth, a younger but fiercely ambitious commander. His pale yellow eyes gleamed with a mixture of arrogance and uncertainty as he gave his report. "The destruction is total, Overlord," Zelroth said, his voice low, measured. "No survivors, no escape pods, not even a single data core remains." It was methodical, precise. Kraveth remained still. "Who?" Zelroth hesitated. Then carefully, he spoke, the word that no Drakthal had dared utter in years. "Humans." The chamber grew deathly silent. The Overlord's slitted pupils constricted, his jaw tensed, fangs pressing together as he stared at the flickering projection. Impossible. Humanity was gone. Their fleets burned. Their colonies nothing but cinders. The last remnants of their military had been eradicated years ago. The few who survived had scattered like insects, running to the fringes of known space where they would inevitably wither and die. And yet, his claws drummed against the stone-like armrest. This was no desperate act of survival, no mere raiding party. This was war. "They have been allowed to exist for too long," Kraveth murmured, his voice like distant thunder. "We should have purged every last ember when we had the chance." Zelroth straightened, nodding. "Shall I mobilize a fleet? If there are survivors, we will hunt them down. End this." "No." The word was final. Zelroth blinked in surprise. "Overlord?" Kraveth's gaze darkened. He was no fool. He had crushed countless rebellions, wiped out entire civilizations that dared resist the might of the Drakthal. He knew the cost of reckless response. This was not the work of desperate fugitives. It was something else. If the humans were striking from the shadows, that meant they were preparing for something bigger. And if that was the case, then sending a mere fleet would be walking into a trap. No. This would require something far worse than a fleet. He would drag them out of their hiding places. He would make them suffer. "The time for hunting them like prey is over," Kraveth said, standing. His towering form cast a long shadow over the chamber, his heavy armor scraping like stone as he moved. "It is time we remind them of their place." Zelroth inhaled sharply. "You mean Kraveth's voice was quiet, but in that quiet there was a promise of death. Burn a colony. Ezel Roth nodded swiftly, knowing better than to question the Overlord's command. He turned, barking orders to his officers. Within moments, a directive was sent across the Drakthal War network. A target would be chosen, an example would be made. And when the flames consumed yet another world, the humans would have no choice but to reveal themselves. Then, and only then, would the real slaughter begin. The gathering storm aboard. The Resolute. Carter watched the navigation screen as the ship drifted through deep space. The distant stars, swirling beyond the reinforced glass. The attack had been flawless. A victory. But the weight in his chest would not leave him. They had struck first. They had drawn blood. And now, the enemy would come. Lena approached, arms crossed. Her expression, mirroring his thoughts. They'll retaliate. Carter nodded. And we have to be ready. The war they thought had ended was about to begin anew, but this time humanity would not be caught unprepared. This time, they would fight. And they would win. The world of Ifra 4 was not a battlefield. It was a colony. A quiet and thriving settlement where humanity had tried to rebuild after the war. It had no warships, no planetary defenses, no soldiers standing watch. It was a home, built upon the fragile hope that the Drakthal had truly moved on, that the war had been lost, but life could continue. That illusion shattered in a single night. Without warning, the sky burned red as Drakthal warships descended upon the planet. The air filled with the howling shrieks of atmospheric entry, great plumes of fire trailing behind the invading vessels as they cut through the sky like predatory birds. Sirens wailed, buildings trembled under the first barrage, the streets erupted into chaos, families ran, parents clutched their children, old men and women stood frozen, watching in horror as the nightmare they had escaped came back to devour them once more. Then came the first impact. A shockwave of destruction spread through the city's center as the Drakthal bombardment began. Buildings folded like paper. Streets cracked open. The screams of the dying mixed with the deep, guttural roars of the alien war machines that now stalked the surface, hunting every last human that remained. They did not ask for surrender. They did not demand submission. This was not a battle. This was a message written in fire and ash. The warning that came too late. Aboard the Resolute, Carter stood motionless as the distress signal repeated for the 10th time. The broken voice of a colony administrator pleading for help. Static crackled between the words. Coming down everywhere. No way out. Please, for the love of God. A scream. Then, silence. The transmission cut off. For a long moment, no one on the bridge spoke. The weight of it sat on all of them, the cold, merciless truth. They had struck the Drakthal, and the Drakthal had answered. Lena's voice was tight. How many survivors? A grim-faced officer scanned the incoming data, his voice barely above a whisper. None. The word landed like a hammer. None. An entire colony. Gone. Carter exhaled slowly, forcing the burning rage in his chest to stay controlled. This was what the Drakthal did. They had always been monsters, but now, after years of pretending humanity was beneath their notice, they had proven something far worse. They were afraid. The Overlord had not sent an extermination fleet for the sake of eradication. He had done it because he needed humanity, to show themselves, to crawl from the shadows, to retaliate in blind fury, to be exposed. Carter turned away from the dead signal. The faces of his crew reflected the same unspoken understanding. This war had already begun, and there was no turning back. The hidden army, in the depths of an uncharted nebula, far beyond the reach of the Drakthal, a fleet stirred. Not a scavenger. Force. Not a handful of survivors clinging to broken ships. A fleet. It had been built in silence, piece by piece, in the hidden corners of space where no alien eyes had wandered. Decades of exile had not broken humanity. It had hardened them, forged them into something relentless. Here, among the cold stars, they had planned for the day when the war would find them again. And now, that day had come. Aboard the largest warship, a dreadnought whose name was long forgotten to official records, Admiral Jonathan Hale stood before the assembled commanders of what remained of the true human fleet. His uniform was black, unmarked, no symbols of a nation that no longer officially existed. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The Drakthal made a mistake, Hale said. His voice was steady, cold. They think they burned our past, that we are nothing but embers, scattered in the wind. He looked at each of them in turn. Men and women who had fought when Earth still stood. Young officers who had grown up knowing nothing but exile and war. Soldiers who had buried too many to count. He exhaled. They don't understand fire. Long silence followed. Then quietly, one of the officers spoke. Sir? Hale's gaze was like steel. They thought we were weak, he murmured. They thought we would vanish. A slow breath. Now, we will show them the truth. He turned toward the vast tactical display behind him. The Resolute's latest transmission played before them, the final moments of HFY 4 looping in silence. Then, at last, he gave the order that had been waiting in the darkness for far too long. No more hiding. All ships, prepare for war. The Drakthal overlord stood atop his throne in the heart of Karzan, the capital of his empire. It was a world of obsidian towers and endless war banners, a fortress that had never fallen in all of its long, brutal history. From here, the overlord had ruled for centuries, watching with cold satisfaction as his fleets crushed species after species, bending the galaxy to his will. But tonight, he did not look out upon his domain with pride. Tonight, he stared into the void beyond his war-torn skies where the impossible had happened. The human fleet had arrived. It was not a scouting party, not a desperate counterattack of a dying species. It was a storm. Thousands of warships emerged from the void, their engines burning with the fire of long-held vengeance. They were sleek, angular vessels, not crude salvaged wrecks, but purpose-built, instruments of war. Carriers, dreadnoughts, destroyers, each one bristling with the kind of firepower that should not have been possible for a species that had been exterminated. And at the front of this unstoppable wall of steel and fury, one ship stood larger than the rest, the Resolute. The vessel had been a ghost for years, whispered about in terrified rumors among the Drakthal fleet. It had survived battles it should have lost. It had outmaneuvered entire armadas, and now it led the final charge against the empire that had tried to erase its people from history. On the bridge of the Resolute, Admiral Hale stood motionless, watching the enemy capital grow, larger on the view screen. His face was unreadable, but his officers could feel the tension radiating from him, the calm before the final strike. A voice crackled over the fleet-wide comms. It was Carter. "We've come a long way for this." His tone was steady, yet, behind it, there was something sharper, something unbreakable. The Drakthal thought they could erase us, that we were nothing but prey to be slaughtered. He exhaled. They were wrong. Across the fleet, weapons powered up. Shields flickered to full strength. Engines burned hotter as the entire armada surged forward toward the capital world of the Drakthal. And then, in a single moment, the battle began, a reckoning of fire and fury. The first barrage came from the Drakthal defenses, great planetary rail cannons, capable of tearing apart entire warships. Massive plasma lances fired from orbital stations, raking through the void toward the human fleet. The sky turned into a killing field. But the humans did not break formation. They weaved through, the firestorm with merciless precision, their ships darting between the death rays like predators closing in on wounded prey. Advanced deflection fields absorbed glancing blows, while countermeasures sent enemy missiles spiraling into the void. Then came the human retaliation. It was not a counter-volley. It was annihilation. Railguns screamed, sending hyper-dense slugs, tearing through Drakthal hulls like paper. Kinetic bombardments turned enemy stations into molten debris in seconds. EMP bursts fried entire planetary defense grids, leaving cities naked and exposed beneath the coming storm. And then, the dreadnoughts moved in. One by one, the great bastions of the Drakthal fleet, ships that had stood undefeated for centuries, were torn apart, not by superior numbers but by superior tactics. The humans did not waste shots. They did not engage in reckless dogfights. They hunted, they cornered, they executed. On the bridge of his flagship, the Overlord watched in horror as his invincible war machine collapsed around him. His forces were being overwhelmed, not by some desperate last stand, but by an unstoppable, calculated force of destruction. His empire was burning, and it was human hands that held the torch. The last stand of the Drakthal desperation turned to madness. With his fleet disintegrating, the Overlord made his final gambit, a planetary lockdown. He issued the order, and instantly the entire capital world was sealed off behind planetary shields. The last remnants of his armada retreated, fleeing behind the barriers in a futile attempt to buy time. On the bridge of the Resolute, Admiral Hale merely watched. Then, with an almost quiet voice, he spoke a single sentence. Begin the operation. The humans had not come for conquest. They had not come to occupy. They had come for justice. The next phase of the assault was not a bombardment. It was precision. Sabotage teams, trained in secrecy for years, infiltrated the shield systems under the cover of battle. Hacked planetary networks collapsed from within. Entire defense grids went dark in an instant. And then, the shield fell. The Overlord barely had time to react before the first drop pod slammed into his palace. Carter led the charge. The human soldiers who stormed the capital were not mindless killers. They did not slaughter civilians. They did not revel in bloodshed. They moved with cold efficiency, cutting through the last Drakthal warriors with merciless precision. Every room was cleared. Every stronghold was dismantled. The Overlord fled, through the broken halls of his own palace, stepping over the bodies of his most loyal guards. He had conquered 100 worlds, and yet now he was nothing but prey. At last, he reached the throne room, and Carter was already there, waiting. The Overlord lunged, roaring in fury, but Carter dodged effortlessly. The human soldier moved like lightning, striking with a blade that found its mark. A final gasp of pain, a body collapsed onto the cold obsidian floor. The war was over, and humanity had won. The dawn of a new era. For the first time in history, the Drakthal Empire no longer existed. In the days that followed, the human fleet did not claim the ruins for themselves. They did not establish dominion over the broken world. They simply left. Their mission had never been conquest. It had never been about power. It had been a reckoning, a message written in the shattered remains of an empire that once thought itself untouchable. And the galaxy understood. Humanity was not weak. They were not gone. They had endured. And now, they had proven what should have never been doubted. They ruled the stars, not through tyranny, but through the unbreakable will to survive. And no one would ever make the mistake of underestimating them again.